Testing 1, 2, 3. Good afternoon, one and all. My name is Todd D. Decker. I'm the administrator for the Bishop Hill Heritage Association. Want to thank you all for joining us today. We have people joining in from all over the Midwest and even Mexico. And I also want to thank you for your flexibility for doing this as a Zoom session instead of in person. Now, this is our first time doing, we've done Zoom meetings before here at the Heritage, but never a Zoom presentation. So if there are any little hitches along the way of a tech variety, we apologize ahead of time. Before I introduce our presenter today, before I introduce John, I just want to do a couple reminders for not only this presentation, but future ones. Our format for today is Dr. Wagner will do an overview of Bishop Hill County history using a PowerPoint that should take 40 to 45 minutes long. During that time, please mute your microphone until the presentation is over. At the end of the presentation, please unmute your microphone and then you can ask Dr. Wagner questions, or if you wish, you can type your questions on the chat in the chat room, and I will present them to John. Also like to make an announcements that our next program on June 5th with Dr. Carolyn Anderson will also be Zoom. Her presentation will be on the material culture of the Bishop Hill Colony, and I'll be sending out information to our members and press release and posters starting on Monday. And it'll be the same format as this one, in which you have to request a Zoom link. I can see so far we have 22 people coming in, so that is wonderful. I also want to remind everyone that this is being recorded, and with the permission of Dr. Wagner, of course. And what will happen is sometime here in the near future, no later than this winter, hopefully sooner, this lecture will be placed on the Bishop Hill Heritage Association YouTube channel for free public viewing. So if people miss this or want to rewatch it, it'll be on our YouTube channel. So, got a couple more people joining in. That's great. So let me introduce Dr. Wagner. He is a professor at Knox College who has studied Bishop Hill and communal societies for decades, published many papers and done many presentations. It's a great way to start our program series this year because, again, this is part of the Dairy Building Program series, even though we're not in the dairy building, to celebrate the 175th anniversary of the Bishop Hill Colony. And purpose of these lectures is to study various aspects of Bishop Hill Colony and the legacy of the colony to modern day times. So besides today's program, we also have Carolyn's June 6th and Lily Saradell. On June 19th, we'll talk about the women of the Bishop Hill Colony. We're hoping that'll be our first in-person one. We'll see how COVID hits here. But we're gonna have a series of these programs throughout the rest of the year. So please, keep checking our website, Facebook page, emails for updates about these programs. So without further ado, I will turn it over to Dr. Jon Wagner for his presentation on the Bishop Hill Colony. And thank you so much, Jon. Where is Jon? We might have had our first glitch. So Jon, you need to unmute and start your video. Knew we're gonna have some glitches. Didn't know it was gonna be right away. Hopefully Jon's not having issues of his own, because we wanted to play a PowerPoint for you guys today. So let's give him a couple minutes here. Bum, bum.
Can you hear me?
Yes, there he is. Oh my gosh, that's a nice background.
Oh, yeah, it ain't here.
It's better than mine.
Yeah, but now I have to share a screen, right?
Yes.
Yeah, how does that happen?
See, Jon's a lot more experienced with that. He's been teaching online like this for months now. He's a lot more experienced than I am with this.
Yeah, except this is the first time I've done this when somebody else started the meeting. Oh, here it is. This has got to be it. This is it. It's going to happen. Just wait.
Uh-oh. Houston, we're experiencing technical difficulties.
Host disabled participant. It's your fault.
Me?
It's your fault, Todd. Host
Why?
disabled participant screen sharing.
How did I do that?
I don't know.
So I need to play the PowerPoint from here?
We could do that.
Okay.
We could do that. I could just tell you when to click.
I can do that because I do have
let's
that.
do that. You remember the old days when the presenter would have to say, next slide, please.
All right, am I sharing the screen is a question.
Okay.
Okay, I am screen sharing, so.
Yeah, okay, good. I will now close this window on mine.
All right,
Right.
there we go.
Okay, so I put in a couple of new slides just now, and it doesn't matter that you can't see them because they're not that important. Go ahead and show the next line of type. Okay, so it just said Jon Wagner, Professor Emeritus, but I was going to explain how I got to this point. When I was a graduate student at Indiana University, I decided that I wanted to study a most peculiar communal utopia in southern Indiana that I'd heard about. It was very intriguing. It was rather old-fashioned in a lot of ways. It wasn't a hippie commune. It was more of a religious commune with many of the earmarks of 19th century communal utopias. And I ended up living in that community and writing about it. I wrote a 450-page dissertation on that community as a result of having lived there. And it was run by a charismatic leader who was in his 50s. As I lived in and studied that community, I also read about lots of other both contemporary and historical communities. Communitarian living started in the Americas way back in the 1700s or even in the 1600s. And the great decade of communal building in America was in the 1840s, actually, as it happens, the very same decade that Bishop Hill came to be. I learned a lot about these communities, and I was surprised by the number of parallels that existed between those communities and the one I was studying in the 1970s. I came to Knox College partly because I'd heard so many wonderful things about it. And I was also aware that it was in the proximity of a 1840s communal utopia. That wasn't my main reason for coming here. I came because of its reputation as an excellent institution. But when I was interviewing for the job, they said, by the way, we see you've done some archaeology. Would you lead a historical archaeology dig in Bishop Hill for, well, several years in a row? And I said, why I wanted the job, and I had done archaeology. So I said, sure, of course I would, even though I was still typing away on my dissertation. So the first thing we did was to locate the foundations of the colony bandstand, which now has been reconstructed and stands in the middle of the colony park. Anyway, so I learned more about Bishop Hill. I became more and more addicted to Bishop Hill history. I joined the board of directors of the Bishop Hill Heritage Society, got to know a great many people, including lots of old timers, and became more and more immersed in the history of Bishop Hill. So, and I remained that way for a long time. Over those first 10 years, I published quite a few things. I later moved on to write about many, many other communal utopias, and then also moved on to write about a broad variety of other things. Now, I want to say that I've been to Sweden. I've been to Denmark, very close to Sweden, right there across the bridge. I don't speak Swedish, as many of our presenters later in this series do. And so there's a lot that I don't have to offer. But what I do have to offer is a perspective on Bishop Hill that's comparative, both with contemporary and especially with other 19th century Bishop Hill or other 19th century communal colonies. And so one of the things I want to raise is points about how they are both similar to and different from the colonies that arose during the 19th century across America. Okay, next slide, please. Next. So first, we're going to have a historical overview of both Bishop Hill and some other things. Next. Then I'm going to bring out some puzzles, some ways.
I couldn't hear what you said.
Oh, that's my watch talking to me. I'll put her aside. Sorry, Siri. Some puzzles, some things that don't quite line up with what might be expected. Next. And finally, leave some time for your thoughts and questions. And I hope that later in this series, some of you who have much to add, know things that I don't, and maybe have some answers to these questions, or maybe have new questions to bring up, will follow through on much of this. Next. The images that appear in this presentation owe much to the painter Olaf Kranz, who came to Bishop Hill at the age of 12 in 1850. And he lived to about the 19 teens, I think 1916. He did most of the images that we're going to see late in life from memory, but his memory was excellent for detail. So we owe him a lot of what we know about daily life in Bishop Hill and what the colony looked like and what the people looked like, thanks to Olaf Kranz. And when you visit Bishop Hill, you'll be able to see many of the restored paintings that Olaf Kranz did in the Colony Museum at the south end of the village. Those paintings were once in the Colony Church at some risk because it wasn't the kind of environmentally controlled place that they really needed to be in. So now they're in a really safe location, and you can see them in person, so to speak. Anyway, we will have a lot of images that we owe to them, but also to other contemporary sources. Next. To put Bishop Hill in historical perspective, the first half of the 19th century in Europe was a time when there was a lot of religious ferment. Of course, Martin Luther had come along and challenged the total authority of the Catholic Church. But Lutheranism in itself became a state church. And so it continued to be the case that ordinary people could not, for example, get together and read the Bible in their own tongue, or even in Latin if they could read Latin, without a clergyman present. The authorities still had a tight grip on the interpretation of Scripture, so that to gather in your own home and ponder the meaning of Scripture was a crime. You could be arrested for it. So religious rebels were sometimes labeled themselves readers, people who would get together and read the Bible. So a Bible study session then was an act of rebellion. And the Swedes were not the first to become involved in this, but by the 1840s, the readers movement was sweeping across Sweden, and Erik Janssen and some others were prominent leaders among the readers in Sweden, particularly in northern Sweden, where Erik Janssen was a prominent figure. Northern Sweden was a fairly rural, even by Swedish standards, part of Sweden. Next slide. And this is right. This was this is a painting done from memory, I believe by Janssen, or I mean by Kranz, and depicting a village scene in, I believe, Helsingland, which was the kind of setting where Erik Janssen came from. Janssen was an unusual figure, even from his youth. He had a vision. He fell off the cart, fell off the cart, and injured himself, and had a vision in which he was told that he was special and that he was to become a leader, and that his visions would be special. By 1846, after only a few years of traveling and preaching, he had gathered a very large following, and he had converted some people who were previously leaders in their own right in the Readers' Movement. And he was also targeted as a dangerous person. He was arrested, he was rescued, he was spirited into hiding. And in 1846, he and a number, Carolyn Wilson, I believe, has placed that number at 1,400 people, left Sweden in a series of crossings across the Atlantic to America. They had already sent scouts who had located what seemed to be promising land in what is now Henry County, and in the area around what is now Bishop Hill, Illinois. Next slide. It was a dangerous crossing, and some of the ships didn't make it. Some of the people in the ships didn't make it. And next slide. When they arrived in this location that became Bishop Hill, they had no money. This was a common fate of people who made the crossing, not just the Bishop Hill colonists, but the people who crossed often arrived in the fall, and whether or not they had money to buy food, it didn't matter, because arriving on the frontier, there was no place to purchase food. It was too late to plant crops, and they were exhausted and often sick from their rigorous crossing. In the case of the Jansenists, they had to not only make the crossing by sea, then they had to take the canal as far as Chicago, the Erie Canal and the other passings to Chicago, and then they had to walk from Chicago to the present location of Bishop Hill. When they got there, there was no place to live, there was nothing to eat. And they found what is now the Bishop Hill Park. There was a deep a deep ravine where the park is now, and the creek ran through it. And on the banks of the creek, they built these semi-underground log dwellings called the dugouts that are depicted in one of Janssen's paintings. I mean, sorry, not Janssen's paintings, one of Olaf Kranz's paintings, although Kranz himself never saw them. In fact, after the first year or so, they filled in that ravine, completely covered it over to erase the memory of these horrid dugouts where people died daily. They were dragging corpses out of these unsanitary dugouts every day. There is today in the park a fountain, a drinking fountain, I think it's still there, that according to legend was once in Ripley's, believe it or not, as the only drinking fountain, or the only fountain that was never dug. And actually it goes down to where the old creek was, or is, and then covered up and extended all the way to what is now the present surface of the pond. I don't know if that's true, but that's the legend in any case. It was such a terrible winter that about a third of the migrants died, according to some accounts. And of those who stayed a little distance from present Bishop Hill at a place called Red Oak, of the 70 who stayed there at Red Oak, according to some accounts, 50 died. There's a memorial there now. Now, there's a man who left Bishop Hill, and what is his name? Anders Larson, if I remember correctly, who left Bishop Hill, or left the group slightly before arriving over doctrinal differences. But he visited the colony late in the first spring, and he praised what they had done. He still had differences with Janssen's religious doctrines, but he praised the wonders of what they had accomplished. They had 2,000 acres of crops planted by that time, he said. Now that's no small accomplishment, because this was unbroken prairie. The Native Americans in this part of America did not farm the prairie because they could not farm it with the tools they had. The hoes that they had made from stone or clamshell blades could not break the prairie. The prairie was so thick and so deep, you could carve blocks from it and make houses, which my great-grandparents did in Kansas. You couldn't break it with ordinary hand tools. So Kranz painted from memory this painting, which is now in the Bishop Hill Museum, of Breaking the Prairie. And what you see here is, you see in both the distant and the near images, 6 yoke of oxen, 2 on each yoke. So 12 oxen pulling what appears to be a single furrow, a single bottom plow. So to break one furrow, 12 oxen. You can imagine how intensive, how labor intensive, how long it took to make a field that was plantable. They were so impetuous about their labor that they not only prepared thousands of acres of prairie, they also rented their labors out to neighbors to break those neighbors' prairies for them. So they had, I think we need to go back one slide. It says how many. Yeah, 2,000 acres of crops planted the first spring. They had made dwellings. They had a sawmill, a flour mill. They had made workshops. All of this the first season. Okay, next. So wonders indeed. The colony church, they had made a church in, I believe it was 1846, in the park. It was a tent church, and it was destroyed by fire. By 1848, just 2 years, they had built the church that now stands in Bishop Hill, which is, some people say it looks suspiciously like something that you might expect to see in one of the Shaker villages like Pleasant Hill, although it's never been shown for sure that that was the inspiration for it, but it's still there. And then most remarkably, in 1848, just 2 years after their arrival, they began construction of Big Brick, which by the time it was completed in 1851, was the largest, said to be, the largest building in America west of Chicago. It was 4 stories tall, including the ground floor. And it was, I'm relying on memory now, 200 feet long. And by some accounts, it had 96 family rooms, although an honors student at Knox College got hold of the original blueprints and found that the lowest floor there, the one in the light color, was actually a communal dining hall. So that was not individual family rooms. So it was actually 74 individual family rooms. But we'll come back to the meaning of this Big Brick later on. Also in the background, you can see the brewery and bakery buildings. Next slide. And here you see the meat storage building, among other things. The brewery and bakery buildings were torn down in order to enlarge the baseball diamond in the, I believe it was 50s or 60s, which by the way was the inspiration for a really organized effort to preserve what was left then of the colony. But this is the on your left here, the meat storage building built in 1851, and it's still there. It is very much in need of help, but it's still there. Next. The carpenter and paint shop, still there. Next. The hotel. They built a hotel building because Bishop Hill was on the main stagecoach line from Peoria to the Quad Cities. And they didn't like the idea of outsiders staying just anywhere in Bishop Hill. They still, even after 8 years, or rather 6 years of being there, they still like to keep to themselves to a large degree. So they built a hotel so that people, either family and friends of colonists or outsiders passing through, would have a place that suited their tastes and impressed them with the modernity and affluence of Bishop Hill, and at the same time kept them a little bit at arm's length. And that building, again, is still there, and again, could use some help. Next. The Colony Store, 1853, which today is a building where people can go and shop for imported delights from Sweden. And in its day was a place where colony members could go and obtain things that were meted out to them as part of their property, part of what was owed them. For example, 2 suits of clothing every year and shoes when they wore out and so on, as their due as members of the colony. Next. I really need to go and get new pictures. And I apologize to this, Todd. I apologize to everybody who's been part of the great effort to make this building look new again, and it really does. And this is an old picture. It looks wonderful now. But this is the steeple building, and it served many purposes over the year. And after the colony, like so many, after the colony decline, which I'll talk about, like so many colony buildings, it was made into private apartments, and then it was a bank, and then it was a museum, and then it was another museum, and now it's a very nice modern visitor center and museum. That's the what they call the steeple building. Next. And other Bishop Hill buildings. Now, these two on the top are architecturally similar, and they are along the south side of the square. And then along the west side of the square is, oh, no, I'm sorry, that the one on the upper right is not on the square, it's the dairy building. And it's been, that's right, isn't it, Todd?
Correct.
Yeah, okay. That's been done right by. When I first saw it, and when Todd first saw it, it needed a lot. And now it's become quite nicely restored. And the one on the bottom was the Colony Hospital, 1855. People would come from miles around if they needed medical attention. It was the only modern, by its, contemporary standards, medical facility for miles around. Next. And this is this one is on the south side of the square. This is the administration building during colony times. Next. The blacksmith shop, which now houses crafts and a presentation venue, performance venue. Next, another structure that needs to be represented better. It's now under renovation, right?
Yes.
And this is an interesting story here. When I came to Bishop Hill, and my first job as an archaeologist, historical archaeologist, was to find out where this building was, how it was oriented, and what size it was, what its shape was, and so on, because it existed only in photographs. And the only things you could orient it with were all gone. The fence was gone. Well, actually, the fence wasn't gone. It was restored. And other things were gone. Of course, the trees were gone. And so we did a lot of digging, looking for the evidence of the post holes that showed where the gazebo or bandstand, as it was called, had been. So we were there on our hands and knees, looking for the evidence of post holes, which archaeologists often do, historical archaeologists. So people would come by and ask what we're looking for, and the Knox students who were doing this work would say, holes. And so the visitors would say, right. Anyway, next. Oh, and by the way, this is now under, it was restored to something a bit nicer than what you see in this picture. This is after some years of deterioration, for the visit of the King of Sweden. What year was that, Todd?
1996.
96. And in this vicinity, various things happen every year, like the music performances at Jordbruk Sagana, the agricultural days. Next. Another building that has been taken better care of now is the Colony School, which was retired from use as a colony school quite some time ago, before my time, but has been used for many civic events, and also for barn dances and other things, and is still in very good condition, I guess. I would say, I don't know if you'd agree, Todd, and maybe you'd say that it's overdue for attention.
Use a little work, but it's better than it was.
Well, yeah. 61, yeah, sure. Why wouldn't it be? Yeah. So those are some of the buildings. And as you can see, given its age, much more of the buildings are still standing and still really capable of being properly restored than you might expect for a village of this age. And I think that's testimony partly to the regard in which they're still held by many, and also testimony to the quality with which they were built. And now I want to talk about what went on there. It was a communal economy. Now, many of the religious colonies or communities that were made in the United States, Amana and Zoar and the Harmony Society and so many others, were built mainly for the sake of being a place where people of like mind could worship in the way they wanted to. And they didn't necessarily establish themselves in order to have a cooperative economy. But they were sort of inclined that way because they believed in taking care of one another. And they didn't really believe in social hierarchy. And so when they found that they were able to thrive better coming over by pooling their resources, in many cases, they decided as a sort of a practical measure that this worked pretty well. Why don't we keep on doing it? So in other words, they didn't come here to be communes. They came here to worship freely, but they also adopted communal life as an expedient way of doing that. So, and it also fit with many of their ideals. So you could say that, for example, Amana colonies didn't come here to be communes, but it fit. And that may have been the case with Bishop Hill too. So there's always been a kind of a debate as to whether Bishop Hill came here to be a communal society or whether it came here and was communal as an expedient, and whether their intention was ultimately to stop being communal. We'll come back to that question. But for now, I just want to talk about how they did things for most of the time that they were, well, really all of the time that they were together as an operating society. Property was held in common. Nobody got wages. Nobody held private wealth. Food, clothing, and other goods were produced internally. They were only bought in cases where there was no other way. And usually that didn't happen because they were some of the cleverest producers of goods anywhere around. People bought things from them. Their material needs were provided to everyone equally. And although it was tough at first, as soon as they got rolling, and that was pretty fast, people were well fed and well clothed. Work requirements were equal. Not everybody did exactly the same tasks, but they were, as insofar as possible, equal in demand and what they demanded of people. And tasks were performed cooperatively. And tasks were, as much as possible, rotated among people, especially taking into account preferences and skills. The work, as in all the communal societies that I know of that time, was done more efficiently because of the economy of scale. So life on the frontier was really very demanding. There wasn't a lot of time for leisure, and people didn't expect a lot of time for leisure. They really worked hard. So in communal economies, they, if anything, had probably less drudgery than they did in individual households scattered across the countryside. And they also, it typically had the latest technology, and they certainly did in Bishop Hill. They always reached out for whatever was the latest thing and would have it before their neighbors would have it. So, and again, because of the technology or the advantage of scale, they were more organized and efficient. They were the first people to use the grain cradle, which you'll see some pictures of in use here soon. It was a special harvesting implement that would cut and scoop up the grain all in one operation. And they took advantage of the latest technology when there was a machine harvester built. They tried one and they didn't like the first versions that came out. They tried building their own. When they were able to get one they liked, they not only got it, but they rented it out, or rather they rented out their labor to neighboring farms using the machinery. Work assignments were based on age and gender, but not always necessarily on the Swedish plan. Women made and laid bricks, they built bridges. Preferences and skills were taken into account, but there was frequent rotation of jobs. The cooperative spirit was said by colonists themselves to be of high morale. Next. They were very productive. Flax and linen cloth was turned out in huge amounts. They had a brick factory, they had a sawmill, they had a flour mill that not only served their needs, but served the needs of neighbors from some distance around. Same way with their blacksmith, their tannery, their machine reaping, and their hospital. Their wagon and buggy manufacturing was so good that they sold wagons to the Shakers at Bishop Hill. Now, the Shakers, as you may have heard from, for example, Shaker Furniture, was known for its perfection of craftsmanship. The Shakers believed that craftsmanship was an offering to God. So shoddy craftsmanship was almost like heresy. And they greatly admired perfection in craftsmanship. The Shakers at Pleasant Hill are said to have bought wagons made in, did I say, the Shakers at Pleasant Hill were said to have bought wagons made in the wagon shop at Bishop Hill. That really says something. After some experiments with growing linen, and they were producing linen by the ton, but then they discovered that it was even more profitable to grow broom corn and make brooms. Now, oddly enough, the Shakers were the ones who invented the flat broom, it is said. Until the Shakers came up with the flat broom, brooms were round. So the Shakers invented the flat broom, but the Bishop Hill people made them in such quantities that they became a major exporter of flat brooms and a major producer of broom corn to make flat brooms. So they were industrialists. They were manufacturers. Next slide. And yet, you might think of, Dickensian scenes of overwork and exploitation. And yet, this was, who wrote this? Maybe somebody will remember. I think it's well, I can't remember who it was now. No one was obliged to overtax his strength. Each one was put to work for which he was best adapted. On the whole, the members of the community enjoyed a greater amount of comfort and security against want than the struggling pioneers by whom they are surrounded. I work with many dear brothers, and one encourages the other with God's words. Next slide. This is one of the most famous examples, and it was misattributed, actually. It appeared on the cover of a book about communal utopias, and it was misattributed to the Shakers. It's actually a painting by Olaf Kranz, who never actually saw this happen. But it is based on a description given to him. What's going on here is that two men, one at each end of this line, a rope, that is marked, spaced at the distance of corn rows. And at each mark, a woman with a bag of corn is digging a hole for the corn and depositing a little bit of corn in that place. And then the, as you can see, the pole at each end is marked about a yard so that they can go to the next spot. They can move that line one spot on. And then we see, next slide, we see the grain cradle. Now, the grain cradle was not known in Sweden. It was the latest thing in America. So they copied the grain cradle. They made their own. So the men are wielding the grain cradles and the women are picking up the sheaves of grain and binding them and leaving them for others to come by and put them on the wagons. The young men wielded the cradles and wonderful feats were performed with the cradle in those days, while the middle-aged men and women bound the sheaves. Boys and girls gathered the sheaves together while the old men placed them in shocks. In the evening, when the day's work was done, 2 by 2, in a long procession, a couple of 100 strong, the harvesters wended their way homeward. First, the men carrying the cradle size over their shoulders, then the women with their hand rakes, and finally, the children all singing some merry harvest song of their native country, while keeping step to the music. On arriving at the village, they repaired to the common dining hall, where a bountiful repast awaited them on long wooden tables. And this was Erik Janssen's son who wrote this. Next. Women building a bridge. Well, next. A family in a big brick. People went to church twice a day for 2 or 3 hours, women on one side, men on the other. Joan, go back, please. Jonas Olson often did the preaching. He was of the two most prominent so-called trustees, or they were mostly early followers of Erik Janssen. He was the one who was most prominently the religious leader, and Olaf Janssen most prominently the leader of practical matters. This is the sanctuary of the church as you would see it today. Every day, the women sat on the left, I believe it was, and the men on the right, as was not uncommon at the time in other churches. And it was an unheated space, so winter and summer, people would sit for 2 or 3 hours twice a day. Next. In 1849, cholera reduced the population to 400 people. Now, according to Carolyn Wilson, who will speak later, it was 1,400 people on record as having left Sweden for Bishop Hill. The low point of population at Bishop Hill seems to have been 400. Some people never made it to Bishop Hill, they died at sea. Some people were discouraged by the fact that They were not able to speak English upon arrival, as Janssen had promised. Some people dropped out because of hardships on the way. In 1850, when Janssen died, and his death was as a result of assassination by a dissatisfied colonist, which I'll talk about momentarily. But the colony continued to grow to about 700. In 1853, colonists voted on a new constitution, which formalized the system of communalism and created 7 trustees. Janssen himself had been assassinated in 1853 by a dissatisfied man who had married a relative of Janssen. A number of colonists had been appointed as trustees. And after Janssen's death, the trustees' leadership was called into question. The result of this was that the colony dissolved under great discontent. And in 1861 was dissolved. Please excuse me for a moment. I have a medical condition that sometimes leads me to have epileptic seizures. And I am now going to take about 1 minute to pause. One minute, please. While I breathe deeply. Thank you for your patience. Let's go back one slide. Go back another slide, please. So, okay, next slide. Try to find out where I was here. Yeah, okay, so death of Erik Janssen in 1850. The community was actually doing well financially, but it was doing well under the leadership of the trustees. And there were, help me on this if you would, Todd, was it 7 trustees?
Yes.
7 trustees, who included Olaf Johnson and Jonas Olson and some of the other original important people in the colony. But they became more and more, shall we say, alienated, or at least separated, and their rule seems to have become less charismatically connected to the community, and more and more administratively disassociated from the community as a whole. And in 1857, this really came to a head when it became clearer and clearer to most of the community that the community was not doing well economically because the trustees were, at least in the popular belief of the community, investing a lot of the community's wealth. The community was actually, as I said, doing quite well in terms of investing their money, but the 1857 economic crisis was leading to greater and greater debt within the community that was not being very honestly reported to the community. So the community was beginning to suspect that a lot of what was going on economically was not favorable and not being honestly reported to the community. The community began to demand more detailed economic reporting, and according to at least part of what was coming down to us through the history, the trustees were becoming less and less forthcoming, and the divide was becoming manifested as a divide between those who wanted to divide up the wealth of the colony and go non-communal, and those who wanted to continue the communal system under the leadership of the trustees. According to some accounts, the pro-communal faction was a little bit larger, but for some reason, the anti-communal faction that wanted to break up the communal system nevertheless prevailed. So around 1860, it fell apart. And what happened was then that all the wealth was portioned out among the community. And this did not go well because so much of what the community had was not very well suited to the use of private households. For example, big brick. How are you going to allocate all these dwellings that had no kitchen, no cooking facilities, no rolling pins, no stoves, no cooking pots? Everything was done communally. How is that going to work? And all the facilities of production were big, large, massive facilities. So how are you going to do that? So what happened was that the manufacturing facilities basically fell apart, and Bishop Hill sort of crashed economically, and most people moved away. And by the time a man named Nordhoff, who was writing about 19th century communal societies, by the time he visited in the 1870s, nobody would talk to him. It was very bitter. And by the 1890s, Bishop Hill was comparatively deserted. So now, next slide. Some puzzles about Bishop Hill. First, well, we're going to go through these one by one. Why America? Why did they come to America? Why did Jansenists assimilate so quickly? Which I haven't really talked about. We'll get to that. Why did they decline so rapidly? Because Amana colonies continued to be prosperous even after they were stopped being communal. Why did they decline so fast? Why did their religion virtually disappear? The Amana colonies still have their religious services in both German, using their original German texts, their perfectionist texts. They still use them. Was it about celibacy? We'll come back to that. What if Janssen had lived longer? I didn't not get to this yet, but Erik Janssen was assassinated in 1850 as a result of a dissatisfied colonist who wanted to marry Janssen's cousin, and was forbidden to do so. And he had actually assassinated Janssen in the end. And one of the biggest questions was, did Janssen intend for the community to remain communal, or was it only an expedient that he intended to end as early as possible? And finally, was Bishop Hill a success? Next slide. Why did all these communal societies arise in America and not someplace else? Next. Amana, the Harmony Society, Zoar, Bethel and Aurora, the Hutterites, the Shakers, and dozens of others. America was the place of communal societies, many of them around the same time, the early 1840s. Well, because of freedom of religion, it was known as the place where you could go and worship freely, and you could practice unorthodox social arrangements. So that's a fairly simple answer. So everybody felt they could come to America. Now, not that they weren't disapproved of. There was disapproval, and there were lots of people who were campaigning against religious societies and claiming that all sorts of awful things went on there behind closed doors. Nevertheless, from the 1600s on, and even now, it is a place where religious communal societies are more likely to be formed than anywhere else in the world. Next. But unlike other immigrant communities, Bishop Hill rapidly assimilated. You can go to the church building today, which is a museum, an interpretive museum. And if you go down the main hallway, you'll see two rooms opposite one another that were, in one time, they were bedroom buildings. And, or rather, they were actually reconstructed deliberately to reflect the difference of time periods. And on one side, there is a room that was built to reflect the Swedish style of furnishings. That's the one on the top. And so you see the Swedish style of bed, of cradle, and so on. And on the other side, you see a bedroom furnished as it would have been only 10 years later in 1860. Is that right, Todd?
Yes.
Yeah, 10 years later in 1860, just 10 years. Furnished in a totally American style with the turned spindles on the beds and so on. 10 years, completely Americanized. Here you see, is that actually supposed to be Kranz?
Yes.
That's Olaf Kranz, dressed for war. He came in 1850. Here he is dressed for the Civil War, ready to go to war. The Amana colonists would have been horrified at this idea of going to fight in the Civil War. Most of the religious communalists in the old world were against war. They were against wearing uniforms. They came away to get away from all that. Bishop Hill mustered a company for the Civil War. They wanted to learn English. They were ready to be Americans. Next. So, and then why did they assimilate, and why did they decline as fast as they did? What was it, the decline of religion? Weren't they serious about their religion? or one of the stories about it was celibacy. One of the stories was that some of the old elders went to Bishop Hill and they learned about celibacy. The Shakers practiced celibacy. If you were married, you had to do away with your marriage and live without sex and live separate from the opposite sex in dorms that were all male, all female, and never be alone with anyone from the opposite sex. And one story has it that they came back from visits to particularly Pleasant Hill with the idea of celibacy and presented it at one of the colony meetings and advocated it. And these were important people, leaders. And that there was so much talk of adopting celibacy that it became, if not the rule, at least a very strong possibility. And a lot of people wanted to just leave Bishop Hill because of that. I followed this up with some research, and I looked at the colony records and so on, and a lot of individual autobiographical accounts. And I concluded that there was very little evidence for this ever having been imposed. It was all just talk. That was my conclusion anyway. And I also found out that the records of the meeting where that was going to be discussed were somehow accidentally lost. They were in the microfilm records at Knox. And in the records, it said, oops, thus and such guy who was supposed to write down all the records forgot to do it. So it was swept under the rug. So I don't think that celibacy had a lot to do with much of anything. So it may have discouraged some people, but I don't think that's what really did them in. What about, was it a failure of leadership? In part, obviously, because there was so much dissent, there was so much disillusion with the leadership. So yes, that was a factor. What if Janssen had lived longer? There's no way of knowing that. Certainly Janssen had a way with people that the trustees did not. So if Janssen had lived longer, very likely things would have gone differently for at least a while. We'll never know. Next slide. But here's the big, to me, this is the big question about Bishop Hill. Was communalism valued in itself, or was it a temporary expedient that was supposed to be done away with? I studied this a lot, and it seems to me that people, well, for one thing, outside of communal societies, there was very low regard for communalism because free enterprise and wealth building and private property were held in very high regard for the most part in America. And common property was not. So the Shakers and all those others, the Harmony Society and so on, were commonly vilified in the press and often very unfairly accused. For example, the Shakers, who were, of course, as you know, celibate, were often widely believed and accused in print of having nonstop orgies when nobody was looking, right? So communalism was scandalous, right? And so people who wanted to defend Janssen would sort of say, no, it's not, they're not really communal. It's just a temporary expedient. So Captain Erik Janssen, Janssen's son, pictured here, said it was not intended to be permanent. And most of his very close associates, his followers, said the same. We just did it because we had to. We didn't really intend to stay that way. We just did it because we had to at first. But by one contemporary account, somebody called Settler, a person who called themselves Settler, who was clearly very familiar with the community and apparently seems to have been a member, at least for some time, said that when they were debating whether or not to split up, the contingent that wanted to stay communal was 2/3 of the colony, and only 1/3 wanted to break it up. So how the 1/3 prevailed, I don't know. And I've looked and looked and looked, to try to find out how that happened, but I've never found anything to explain that. So was it a temporary expedient or not? Well, we can look to other things. Next slide. And one of the things I find is the architecture. Now, Anders Larsen, who visited that first spring, said that they were surveying around the square that's still there. And they were going to make houses, he said 48 houses around the square of equal size that would have been suitable for, you know, big families like people had in those days, but single families. So that they would have single family houses when the community split up. But then at the end of that, Larsen said, but when that split up will take place remains unsaid. So in other words, he was already a little bit skeptical about that idea. That's all he said. The thing is, those 48 houses never appeared. They never appeared. What they did build instead were the buildings you see here. And these are not single family dwellings. Not one of these is a single family dwelling. They built for communal dwelling. They built apartment houses. They never built, yeah, there were single family dwellings built out in the country where people would go out, you know, to tend the cattle and so on. But in the village, they didn't build, I don't know of a single family dwelling that was built in the village. If somebody knows of one, they can tell me. Next slide. So at the top there, we see the inside of the church building. But it was the upper floor was the church, but the lower floor was these apartment buildings with these apartments, and each one had their they didn't have cooking facilities. They had a little heating, you know, but that's all. And then here is on the right, this is which one is this, Todd?
The Colony apartment building by the Colony store.
Yeah, by the Colony store. Yeah, right. And then over here on the left, we see the outside of the church building, and these are entrances that go into underground single family quarters. Nobody goes down there anymore, but so underground single family quarters, and then first floor single family quarters, and then the third floor is the church sanctuary. And then next slide, big brick with all these single family quarters, no cooking facilities, and then the gigantic dining hall in the very first floor. Okay, next slide. Another big question that's always asked of communal societies, and this is all the textbooks, maybe they still do, but they used to always say this. When I first started studying communal societies, all the textbooks said this. They said, yeah, they experimented with communal societies, but they were all miserable failures. You know, ordinary high school textbooks would say this. They were always communal, they were always miserable failures because people weren't made to live like that. So was Bishop Hill a success? Well, I once wrote an article that turned out to be kind of almost famous, I guess you could say, among communal studies scholars. It's not a very big army of communal studies scholars, so big success, I know. But anyway, it was widely read, called How Do You Measure Success? And it was like 14 ways to measure success. But one of them is size. And Bishop Hill did pretty well by that. It was, I don't know, what would you say, Todd? The various things are given as the size of Bishop Hill, and some of them were after Bishop Hill. 1861 was when Bishop Hill stopped being a communal society in legal terms. And it might have been after that that the largest number of people lived there. It might have been 800. I don't know. What would you give, Todd, as the largest number of people who lived in Bishop Hill?
I've heard 800 being the height.
Yeah, communally. And of course, it got smaller after that. The duration, well, let's see, 1861 was when it stopped being communal. So 1846 to 1861. So it's kind of in the middle range, not terribly long. Some of the longest lived ones were over 100 years. So that wasn't terribly long lived. It's not going to be a winner there. Economic security and standard of living, pretty good, I think. I would have to say pretty good. Social cohesion, up until the late 1850s, again, I would say pretty good. It's my opinion. I don't know. Any of you, so a lot of you out there are experts. I don't know if anybody wants to, you might want to weigh in on that later. Outside opinion, they actually, this is a funny one because when the guy who ultimately assassinated Janssen tried to raise an army of people to raid Bishop Hill and help him get his wife back, who didn't want to leave, he was actually turned away by neighbors of Bishop Hill who did not want those vigilantes messing with Bishop Hill, or so this story goes. So apparently they had reasonably good relations with their neighbors who were actually dependent on them for a lot of things. Regional contributions, well, when they first moved into that area, they brought in cash that really was an economic boom to the area. So, and Todd, if you know better than any of the things I'm saying, please come in later and say so. Okay, I don't want to promulgate any historical errors. Historical impact, well, the King of Sweden came here more than once, right?
Yes.
And there's a commemorative stamp issued in Sweden because Bishop Hill was really kind of the initial big bang of the Swedish immigration, and people came to Bishop Hill, and from here went on to other places, including Galesburg also, but other places from here, or having heard of the people who came to this region, came here and moved on from there. Even people who hated the very idea of Erik Janssen and Bishop Hill. So Bishop Hill had a very large historical impact, but also in Sweden, I believe, if I'm not mistaken, had an impact on the reformation of Lutheranism in Bishop Hill. Am I not right? Would you agree, Todd?
Yeah, I can see it at the impact.
Yeah, okay. Satisfaction is another way you can measure success. Now, the thing is, and Lily and other people, well, Lily, especially Carolyn Anderson, Lily said it all. Others. John Norton, others who may be in the audience today, but will be speaking, have translated lots of letters back to Sweden who talk about how they feel about being here. Some people didn't love it, but a lot of people did, and they talk about their their feelings about being here. And there certainly was their share of people who were very pleased with what they found here and with the lives that they had here. So how do you measure success? Okay, part 3. Your thoughts and questions. Next slide. You can unmute.
Yes, please, if you have any questions or comments, unmute and fire away. And we want to stop sharing here and start checking the chat room.
Yeah, I have a question. Thank you, John. That was interesting. You mentioned Anders Larsen coming to survey. More or less, when would that have been?
That was in the spring of 1847. So
Okay.
it was the very first spring that they were here.
Okay. Okay. The very first spring. And
Yeah.
I also had another couple quick questions. You mentioned that the school was built in 1871. So by that time, it wasn't a communal anymore. And I wondered who got to attend the school. Were they equal opportunity, girls and boys, or do you know, is there any record about the attendees?
As far as I know, it was equal opportunity. And I think it was even before that. The first instruction was held in the dugouts, I think, and they hired an English teacher.
Ah, okay.
So they used part of what little cash they had to bring in an English teacher.
And teacher, that's yeah, that's great. And then you also mentioned in the 1840s, 1,400 immigrants came. Is there any record of how many women and how many men, what the proportion was of the immigrants?
I don't remember. I think I knew that at one time, but now that you've asked that, and Lily may know also, but
More women
Hardly more women?
than
Yeah.
men.
and certainly during colony times, there were a lot more women than men. This was true of pretty much all the American communal societies. And at least in the Bishop Hill colony, I think part of the reason was that women, that men were more able to strike off on their own because they could simply hire out. They could, laborers.
Mhm.
They didn't have to speak English. My wife is of Swedish, the Swedish college, or her Swedish immigrants here in Galesburg. And I've listened to her family talk. They say, oh yeah, you couldn't even get a job over here at the what was it, the local lumber mill. You couldn't even get a job over here in Galesburg if you didn't speak Swedish.
Okay.
Yeah, so the job opportunities around this area for men who spoke Swedish, there were plenty of them.
John, I have a question.
Yeah,
You mentioned that you said that 2/3 of the membership wanted to continue communal.
yeah.
Where did you see that?
It was in a series that appeared in, I think it was in the Galva News in while the colony was still in operation. And it was a series by an anonymous person who called him or herself settler.
Yeah, because I have read those minutes, I think all of it, and it was, I can't remember seeing that, anything about that.
I'll have to look in my notes and see if I can pin that down.
It could have been earlier, it was, if it was discussed earlier, but certainly it was not discussed later when there were disagreements.
Yeah. Oh, I really I tried because I really wanted to know who that person was.
Yeah, that would be nice.
Yes.
Yeah, I mean, and what I really wanted to know was how did the 1/3 manage to get their way?
This is Carolyn Anderson.
Yeah, hi, Carolyn.
Actually, the Jonas Olson party, which was pro-communal, was 2/3, and the Olaf Johnson party was 1/3 of the population of Bishop Hill.
So do you
And
think,
I know this because it's I went through all the inventories of the
Yeah.
communal dissolution, and the Olson party was the so-called progressive party that wanted to go out on their own.
so
The Johnson party.
they weren't communal? The Olaf Johnson party.
The Jonas Olson party wanted to remain communal, and the Olaf Johnson party wanted to split up. What happened was that they were planning to dissolve in 1861, and there were a whole bunch of debts to be paid, and they came back, the trustees came back and tried to get money from the communal treasury, and eventually it was totally decimated, and the whole thing, there were lawsuits, and it wasn't really settled till about 1886.
Mhm.
So
Yeah.
So it did not become practical to continue because they couldn't afford it.
yeah, and there were only about 300 people left in Bishop Hill at the time
Mhm.
of about the mid 1860s. The rest of them had moved out onto farms or elsewhere.
Yeah. Yeah.
Well, that's a
You know,
very
there was
important.
one of my music partners in my music group called Hammer and Pick that we've played for so many years. And Wayne Nordstrom, bless his soul, my beloved friend, was descended from one of the trustees. And he said there were still people who held a grudge.
Yeah.
And then Wayne said, sort of mimicking people, he said, Bishop Hill's not so bad. It's just some of the people that lives there.
Are there any other questions? Well, then I want to first off thank
Sure.
John. Oh,
Could I pose a question, please?
oh, sorry.
It seemed to me, particularly in the interest that they had in technology and their ability to build up a number of industries and crafts very rapidly, that they were kind of an exceptional group of folks that gathered. Can you comment on that? Were they exceptional, and if so, why?
Well, I do know that they were, when they were sort of recruiting people. For one thing, they were encouraging people to submit to the kitty, sort of, you know, if they had any wealth. Now, whether that was a requirement, I don't know if anybody knows anything about that. And some people did submit a lot. But it was also common to encourage people who had crafts.
Yes, can you call back in 5 minutes? I'll do that. Someone want to come back in? Any other questions or anything?
Hi, Todd. Can I give a plug for my?
Yes, I was going to, and Lily can do that after you.
I'm going to talk on June 5th about extensive research on the material culture of Bishop Hill, which means what they made, what they ate, what they built. All of these, there are very detailed records of what existed at the time of the dissolution of the colony and many accounts of this. So we're going to take a little deep dive into the nitty-gritty of life in Bishop Hill from the material perspective.
And that'll be June 5th. We're doing that as Zoom as well. So we'll do it the same format where people have to request a link, and we'll start doing that on Monday. And then after that, hopefully our first in-person program will be Lily's on June 19th. And Lily, you want to put a plug in for that program?
Yes, I do. I want to do it in person because I don't have any slides or anything. So I think it would be much better if I'm there in person. And I also hope that my book is ready by then. What is the progress, Todd, on the printing?
The delivery date is June 18th.
Ah, great. Fantastic. The day before.
Mhm.
Okay, so I will be able to
You'll have copies.
sign books. It's called, the book is called Bishop Hill Reframed, Voices from the Past.
How many books does this make for you, Lily?
That's my 25th.
Good for you.
Unbelievable.
Yeah.
I hope to see you all. I missed the pictures of all these participants. Why don't you put up pictures? There is one comment I would like to make about that painting of a village in Sweden that the speaker said that was painted from memory by Olof Krantz. I doubt that very much because it's of Ovansjö in Gästrikland. And I don't think that Olof Krantz had been that far north. What I heard was that there were some colonists from Ovansjö who wanted a painting of their home village, and that they brought a picture to Olof Krantz and he painted it from the picture. It is possible, if it was late in Kranz's career, that they had pictures were sent from Sweden. So that's the story about that village in Sweden.
Anyone else? Any comments, questions, previews of future events? Well, we want to thank you all for coming out on a Saturday, and we'll especially thank John for giving us an overview of the Bishop Hill Colony history. It's a great way to start the program series, and it leads into Carolyn's material culture and Lily's Women of the Bishop Hill Colony. And we'll continue on. Our next program is June 5th, 2 p.m. Zoom, followed by Lily's program on June 19th. And then we actually have another program on that Sunday, June 20th, about U.S. presidents from Illinois. But hopefully we'll start in-person programs on June 19th, followed by midsummer, and hopefully get back to a more normal. So thank you one and all for participating today. Again, thank you, John, so much for doing this. And we
My
hope to
pleasure.
see you back on our future presentations.
Thank you.
Have a good day, everyone.
Thank you.